Ex-Muslims, arguably more than any other group, are deeply familiar with the problems entrenched within Muslim communities and inherent within Islamic scriptures. As most of us happen to be both people of color and first or second generation immigrants, we are doubly affected, both by hatred and violence from Muslims, but also bigotry and xenophobia from the broader American public. Despite all this, my experience over the last 2 years has made me wary of speaking up, even to an audience such as this. I always expected feeling unwelcome from Muslim audiences, but I didn't anticipate an equal amount of hostility from my allies on the left. For example, when I first published a piece fact-checking Raza Aslan, who is a prominent Muslim scholar, on his dismissal of female genital mutilation as only an African problem, not a Muslim one, I got many responses from people unhappy with what I wrote, almost all of whom questioned my motives rather than addressing my claims. To my surprise, most of my critics were not Muslims. Rather, they identified as liberals and sometimes even atheists. Some darkly alluded to my agenda, and others claimed that as a former Muslim, there was no way I could be trusted with fair criticism. There is a curious double standard at play when Muslim clerics and activists that are known to be anti-Semites and homophobes are welcomed on campuses, touring nationally, invited to give lectures by Muslim student associations, while feminists like Asra Nomani, who has been fighting for equality of the sexes, for the right to female entry to the priestly class, is branded as a bigot by the same Muslim student organization, and the authorities at universities like Duke succumb to this brazen attempt to silence her. Similar patterns are repeated across the Western world. Maryam Namazi, who is an ex-Muslim activist, was disinvited to speak at Trinity, Ayan Hirsi Ali at Brandeis. The British Student Union now allies itself broadly with Islamist organizations such as CAGE. To quote Nick Cohen from his article from The Guardian, university managers are no better than their teenage heresy hunters. They say they want to oppose radical Islam in argument. The lawyers' secular society took them at their word. It tried to present an investigation at the University of West London into Islamist groups that were all over campuses, despite their record of advocating Jew hatred, homophobia, and misogyny. The university authorities banned the secularists. Let me be clear. I don't think anyone, even bigots emerging from Muslim communities or anywhere else, should be silenced. What I ask is that we stand up for the right to speak of all, including those, both those who stand with us and those who call for the death of our fellow disbelievers. Our society functions because we believe that hurt feelings mean essentially nothing in the eyes of our justice systems. But of course, it is claimed that this is a special case, because these aren't just personal hurt feelings, these are religious hurt feelings, and not just any religion, but the religion of the underdog, of the brown man. And the left decided long ago that the hurt feelings of the Christian religion mattered little, and it was imperative that we disabuse the notion that Christianity would ever feel safe from criticism or even outright mockery. Indeed, many of our greatest thinkers have delighted in exercising this right. I want to quote Thomas Paine from his book, The Age of Reason. Whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we call it the word of a demon than the word of God. It is a history of wickedness that has served to corrupt and brutalize mankind, and for my part, I sincerely detest it, as I detest everything that is cruel. I wonder if Paine had been murdered for his outright contempt of Christianity, how different would the West look today? What message such a gruesome deed would have sent? How many people would it have silenced with its promise of more bloodshed to come if they had the audacity to repeat his crime? Would that fear have silenced those who insisted on the freedom of speech? How would that have affected the face of our nation? Now, I hope you will reflect on me on the fact that not only was he not murdered, neither was his contemporaries who mocked religion. Also, even then, 3 centuries ago, I don't believe he contemplated the idea that writing would actually lead to his death. And yet, in the 21st century, this is the reality of those who speak out against Islam in Muslim countries, and increasingly in Western ones. It's not uncommon to hear from commentators in various media outlets that the victims of Charlie Hebdo had somehow provoked others with their offensive cartoons into taking their lives. The sentiment seemed to be that the cartoonists must, to some degree, be held accountable for their own murders, even as dozens of cartoonists from the East drew panels in support of their counterparts in the West, risking their own lives for freedom of speech. There are people who use the phrase Islamophobia, both to mean criticism of the people and of the religion. I know that many Muslims do this. It's an easy way of stopping others from criticizing their religion. But I believe that many in the West use this word because they haven't quite thought of why it might be harmful. Islamophobia is a meaningless term. It serves to confuse and to muddle two very different forms of intolerance based on two very different reasons towards which there should be two very different reactions. Sometimes it is claimed that the critique of religion is critique of the identity of the believer and is therefore bigotry. This person's identity happens to be based around their ideology, so if you criticize their ideology, you are necessarily generating hate towards that person. But I wonder what would happen if we applied this type of thinking to everything. What if New Agers decided that criticism of New Age spiritual healing was a form of hate against people who chose to identify that way? What if Hindus decided criticism of the caste system was a deeply offensive form of racism against Hindu people? How much of that would retard reform? And there's another version of this argument which claims that criticism or ridicule of Islam feeds into the bigotry by the far right and therefore causes harm. And I want everyone to know that the argument is almost never that Islam doesn't deserve the critique or ridicule as a religion, but that it is harmful to voice it for the damage that it would do. Still, there are others who believe that people in the West have no right to speak about problems of brown cultures due to the legacy of colonialism and other forms of violence the West has cast upon the East. This is a strange argument because it ignores the history of the world, a history in which various nations, Muslims and non-Muslims, have succumbed to the ebb and flow of conquest repeatedly for all of recorded history. Many Islamic countries, in fact, had horrific laws before colonialism. Two of the epicenters of Islamic thought, Iran for Shia Islam and Saudi Arabia for Sunni Islam, resisted colonialism. In fact, Saudi Arabia was founded in 1744 as an extremist state, the first iteration of which was destroyed by the Ottomans due to their religious fanaticism. The first Saudis, in fact, attacked and desecrated some of the most holy Muslim sites and were stopped not by intervention of the West, but by other Muslims that viewed them as dangerous fanatics. There was then no American imperialism, no frame of wars against other Muslims, and yet fundamentalist Wahhabis existed and were attacking other Muslims very much the same way that ISIS attacks them today. Reform is impossible when you constantly shift the conversation away from Islamic fundamentalism and back to Western violence and imperialism. But don't get me wrong, it's important to discuss this. It's important to discuss imperialism and the harm it caused. But violence in the name of Islam has terrorized the Middle East ever since its inception, and it's important that we don't derail this conversation. The moral paralysis out of fear of the right, out of fear of furthering bigotry, out of shame of prior crimes committed by other white people, should not trump all considerations. When I read articles of why Muslims shouldn't be ridiculed, I get a sense of condescension, a sense that there are those who believe that the most central trait of brown people is their religion, a defining feature, in fact. And due to this, they presume either that we won't reform or we can't. That religion is something inherent to who we are, and that it won't respond to pressure to change the way Christianity responded to pressure by secularists. While they believe themselves to be supporting tolerance, what they're actually supporting is the religious right of the East. And not just any religious right, not the religious right we have here. It's a religious right the West hasn't seen for centuries. To me, to someone who opposes the most foundational liberal principle, the freedom of expression, in order to protect the sensibilities of this Islamist religious right, is a liberal only in name. In fact, What kind of person holds two different groups of people accountable to two different standards of acceptable behavior, but a bigot? Obviously, Islam isn't the root of all evil, but it's an important factor. What we have here is a right wing in the West who believes that Islam personifies evil, and a left which refuses to even look into it as a source of harm. The question then becomes, how do we achieve reform without actually mentioning any problems in Islam? How do we achieve progress while shying away from one of the foundational aspects of how harmful practices are justified? Most cultures are responsive to selective pressure, and by insisting that no pressures be applied, we are acting as a brake on any progress. We have plenty of evidence that a push for secularism or a presence within secular cultures can change behavior and even the beliefs of Muslims. For example, if you compare Muslims living in the US with Muslims in the Middle East, you will find across all metrics that their opinions are less extreme and more in line with liberal values than of those of the population of their origin countries. Many Muslims believe that their religion is immutable, that every word of which is true, and reformers insult them when they demand change. Yet profound changes in the way Muslims practice their religion have occurred in the past. Many Muslim countries practiced slavery up until the 20th century, with some countries abolishing slavery as recently as 1981, citing religious sanction of the practice as a justification. Saudi Arabia's slave population was estimated as 300,000, a scant 50 years ago, and it was international pressure that forced abolition. Under pressure from the British Empire to abolish slavery a little over a century ago, the Sultan of Morocco cited the inerrancy of the Quran to make the case for the divine sanction of slavery. Later, the chief minister of Morocco, Mohammed Idris, wrote in response to anti-slavery efforts that we do not interfere in religious principles which you profess. Likewise, you should not interfere in our religion. In the face of Ottoman unwillingness to condemn the status of slaves as enshrined in Sharia, a British statement sarcastically stated that one might well ask the Sultan to become a Christian. Yet today, most, if not all, Muslims are repulsed by the idea of slaves. Did they abandon the Quran, which seemed to clearly condone slavery a mere century ago, or were we able to shift mainstream consensus by standing up for our moral principles? I wonder what would have happened if the benevolent bigots of the West, of the left today, who feel that it is more important to respect a culture for the sake of respecting a culture, had existed back then. How many millions would be living in chains today? We must remember that there's no inevitable march of progress, no guarantee that tomorrow's world will be more just, more equal, more rational, more tolerant or reasonable. Liberal rights without liberals to champion them are values without influence, with no defense. Let's not let our empathy for oppression of one group excuse their oppression of another. Thank you.
I was a believer. I was a Shia Muslim. It's a little bit different than Sunni Islam, which is the Islam I think a lot of people are familiar with. Shia is a little bit different. It's the kind they practice in Iran. I believed for a long time, and I participated in the local community in Houston, Texas, which is actually a pretty large community of Muslims. And I did that for a long time until I decided that it doesn't make any sense. Philosophy made a big dent, thinking about just morality and how do we get certain concepts and how do we determine right from wrong. As soon as I started looking into what Islam really wanted out of me and what they wanted me to believe, I thought that a lot of this just doesn't feel good or moral or right. So that was, I think, the first thing that I started thinking about before I left. Islam is a gendered religion in the sense that if you are a Muslim, or if you're a Muslim woman and you're a Muslim man, you're going to practice Islam very differently. Those mean very different things to you. What it means to be a good person is two very different things, because those roles are set out for you pretty early. That was something that fundamentally didn't feel right to me at my core, especially since I grew up in the West. So I could see that there were people who lived a more egalitarian life, and that felt on a very deep level more fair, more correct. And so then when I started to look into that, especially the role of women in Islam, I found it to be something that was quite harmful to a lot of women and allowed for a lot of oppressions to go on. Well, it's interesting because I believe that too. When I was a Muslim, I was told that Islam liberated women, that it was the best religion for women, and when Muhammad came, he gave women rights that they never had before. And I believed that, I bought that, and I thought that by making me cover up or encouraging me to cover up, they were protecting me from the evils of the world, and that's because I was special. I was something, that's how they phrase it anyway, that you are particularly special, and that's why you are covered up, like a diamond, they say. So I actually felt that Islam was good for me until I really started looking into the specifics of it. I started looking into what a woman's worth is. For example, there's a lot of specific parts of Islam that dedicate, 2 witnesses that are female for every 1 male in court. Sharia law tells you how inheritance with men and women is different, and it doesn't really make any sense why a daughter would get less inheritance than a son. And so when you look at it through that perspective, it's very clear that it's not an egalitarian religion. I'm an atheist, and I'm a humanist, I'm a free thinker. I call myself all those things. I think they mean different things to me, and I ascribe those labels to myself. I left religion around the age of 16. I met my first ex-Muslim at the age of 21, 22, and then we decided that it'd be good to start an organization where other people can see the benefits of meeting people like them and having that support, and so we started the Ex-Muslims of North America. We don't proselytize, so it is, we're giving comfort and support to those who have already left. I mean, I'm a civil libertarian, so I think that if you are a Muslim and you believe certain things, you have every right to believe that in the privacy of your own home. I have a problem when those beliefs start harming other people, when they start harming women, when they start harming children. That's when I have a problem, and that's when I want to get involved. Otherwise, if that you're going to do whatever you want in the privacy of your own home, that's perfectly fine with me. So I don't really proselytize. But those who have decided that it's not the religion for them, because it is so difficult to leave, if you are a Muslim, because it is so difficult, I think it's really important to have those support and community networks. I'm very passionate about free speech. And it's especially important, I think, now when we're talking about Islamophobia and we're talking about hate speech and how criticism of Islam can be construed to be hate speech. Some people believe that. I don't. I think anti-Muslim bigotry, which is bigotry against Muslim as a people, and criticism of Islam are 2 very different concepts, and it's very important that we hold them apart as much as possible so that our dialogue can be constructive, truly constructive. And there's so many people who want Islamophobia to mean, and so many Muslims especially, who want Islamophobia to mean criticism of the religion as well, not just the people. They want to conflate those 2 terms because it's good for them. They don't want people to talk about their faith in a negative way. And I think that's just such a harmful way of continuing. So I want to encourage people not to use terms like that and openly criticize all bad ideas. I know when I thought to myself, I think I'm an atheist. I think I'm not going to buy any of this. It felt like a weight was just lifted off my shoulders, and the world felt like a bigger and more beautiful place immediately. I mean, it was shocking, and it was kind of scary because now there was this chaos that didn't exist when my world was ordered in the way that Allah wanted it to be. But when I removed that burden from my shoulders, it was just such a more exciting place to be in, and it made some of the harmful aspects of leaving religion a little bit easier to bear.
When I was a child, I knew I had superpowers. That's right. I thought I was absolutely amazing because I could understand and relate to the feelings of brown people, like my grandfather, a conservative Muslim guy, and also I could understand my Afghan mother, my Pakistani father, not so religious, but laid back, fairly liberal. And of course, I could understand and relate to the feelings of white people, the white Norwegians of my country. You know, white, brown, whatever, I love them all. I understood them all, even if they didn't always understand each other. They were all my people. My father, though, was always really worried. He kept saying that even with the best education, I was not going to get a fair shake. I would still face discrimination, according to him, and that the only way to be accepted by white people would be to become famous. Now, mind you, he had this conversation with me when I was 7 years old. So while I'm 7 years old, he said, look, so it's either got to be sports or it's got to be music. He didn't know anything about sports, bless him, so it was music. So when I was 7 years old, he gathered all my toys, all my dolls, and he threw them all away. In exchange, he gave me a crappy little Casio keyboard and yeah, and singing lessons, and he forced me basically to practice for hours and hours every single day. Very quickly, he also had me performing for larger and larger audiences, and bizarrely, I became almost a kind of poster child for Norwegian multiculturalism. I felt very proud, of course, because even the newspapers at this point were starting to write nice things about brown people, so I could feel that my superpower was growing. So when I was 12 years old, walking home from school, I took a little detour because I wanted to buy my favorite sweets called Salty Feet. I absolutely love them. So on my way into the store, there was this grown white guy in the doorway blocking my way, so I tried to walk around him. And as I did that, he stopped me, and he was staring at me. And he spit in my face, and he said, get out of my way, you little black bitch, you little packy bitch, go back home where you came from. I was absolutely horrified. I was staring at him. I was too afraid to wipe the spit off my face, even as it was mixing with my tears. I remember looking around, hoping that any minute now, a grown-up is going to come and make this guy stop. But instead, people kept hurrying past me and pretended not to see me. I was very confused because I was thinking, well, my white people, come on, where are they? What's going on? How come they're not coming and rescuing me? So needless to say, I didn't buy the sweets. I just ran home as fast as I could. Things were still okay, though, I thought. As time went on, the more successful I became, I eventually started also attracting harassment from brown people. Some men in my parents' community felt that it was unacceptable and dishonorable for a woman to be involved in music and to be so present in the media. So very quickly, I was starting to become attacked at my own concerts. I remember one of the concerts, I was on stage, I leaned in to the audience, and the last thing I see is a young brown face, and the next thing I know is some sort of chemical is thrown in my eyes. And I remember I couldn't really see, and my eyes were watering, but I kept singing anyway. I was spit in the face in the streets of Oslo, this time, by brown men. They even tried to kidnap me at one point. The death threats were endless. I remember one older bearded guy stopped me in the street one time and he said, the reason I hate you so much is because you make our daughters think they can do whatever they want. A younger guy warned me to watch my back. He said, music is un-Islamic and the job of whores, and if you keep this up, you are going to be raped and your stomach will be cut out so that another whore like you will not be born. Again, I was so confused. I couldn't understand what was going on. My brown people now starting to treat me like this. How come? Instead of bridging the worlds, the two worlds, I felt like I was falling between my two worlds. I suppose for me, spit was kryptonite. So by the time I was 17 years old, the death threats were endless and the harassment was constant. It got so bad, at one point my mother sat me down and said, look, we can no longer protect you. We can no longer keep you safe, so you're going to have to go. So I bought a one-way ticket to London. I packed my suitcase and I left. My biggest heartbreak at that point was that nobody said anything. I had a very public exit from Norway. My brown people, my white people, nobody said anything. Nobody said, hold on, this is wrong. Support this girl, protect this girl because she's one of us. Nobody said that. Instead, I felt like, at the airport, on the baggage carousel, you have this different suitcases going round and round, and there's always that one suitcase left at the end, the one that nobody wants, the one that nobody comes to claim. I felt like that. I'd never felt so alone. I'd never felt so lost. So after coming to London, I did eventually resume my music career. Different place, but unfortunately the same old story. I remember a message sent to me saying that I was going to be killed and that rivers of blood were going to flow and that I was going to be raped many times before I died. By this point, I have to say I was actually getting used to messages like this. But what became different was that now they started threatening my family. So once again, I packed my suitcase, I left music, and I moved to the US. I'd had enough, didn't want to have anything to do with this anymore. And I was certainly not going to be killed for something that wasn't even my dream. It was my father's choice. So I kind of got lost. I kind of fell apart. But I decided that what I wanted to do is to spend the next however many years of my life supporting young people and to try to be there in some small way, whatever way that I could. So I started volunteering for various organizations that were working with young Muslims inside of Europe. And to my surprise, what I found was so many of these young people were suffering and struggling. They were facing so many problems with their families and their communities who seemed to care more about their honor and their reputation than the happiness and the lives of their own kids. I started feeling like maybe I wasn't so alone, maybe I wasn't so weird. Maybe there are more of my people out there. The thing is, what most people don't understand is that there are so many of us growing up in Europe who are not free to be ourselves. We're not allowed to be who we are. We are not free to marry or to be in relationships with people that we choose. We can't even pick our own career. This is the norm in the Muslim heartlands of Europe. Even in the freest societies in the world, we're not free. Our lives, our dreams, our future does not belong to us. It belongs to our parents and their community. I found endless stories of young people who are lost to all of us, who are invisible to all of us, but who are suffering, and they are suffering alone. Kids that we are losing to forced marriages, to honor-based violence and abuse. So eventually I realized after several years of working with these young people that I will not be able to keep running. I can't spend the rest of my life being scared and hiding, and that I'm actually going to have to do something. And I also realized that my silence, our silence, allows abuse like this to continue. So I decided that I wanted to put my childhood superpower to some use by trying to make people on the different sides of these issues understand what it's like to be a young person stuck between your family and your country. So I started making films, and I started telling these stories. And I also wanted people to understand the deadly consequences of us not taking these problems seriously. So the first film I made was about Banaz. She was a 17-year-old Kurdish girl in London. She was obedient. She did whatever her parents wanted. She tried to do everything right. She married some guy that her parents chose for her, even though he beat and raped her constantly. And when she tried to go to her family for help, they said, well, you got to go back and be a better wife. Because they didn't want a divorced daughter on their hands, because, of course, that would bring dishonor on the family. She was beaten so badly her ears would bleed. And when she finally left, And she found a young man that she chose and she fell in love with. The community and the family found out, and she disappeared. She was found 3 months later. She'd been stuffed into a suitcase and buried underneath the house. She had been strangled. She had been beaten to death by 3 men, 3 cousins, on the orders of her father and uncle. The added tragedy of Banaz's story is that she had gone to the police in England 5 times asking for help, telling them that she was going to be killed by her family. The police didn't believe her, so they didn't do anything. And the problem with this is that not only are so many of our kids facing these problems within their families and within their families' communities, but they're also meeting misunderstandings and the apathy in the countries that they grow up in. When their own families betray them, they look to the rest of us. And when we don't understand, we lose them. So, while I was making this film, several people said to me, well, Dia, this is just their culture. This is just what those people do to their kids, and we can't really interfere. I can assure you, being murdered is not my culture. And surely people who look like me, young women who come from backgrounds like me, should be subject to the same rights, the same protections as anybody else in our country. Why not? So, for my next film, I wanted to try and understand why some of our young Muslim kids in Europe are drawn to extremism and violence. But with that topic, I also recognized that I was going to have to face my worst fear: the brown men with beards. Similar men to the ones that have hounded me for most of my life. Men that I've been afraid of most of my life. Men that I've also deeply disliked for many, many years. So I spent the next 2 years interviewing convicted terrorists, jihadis, and former extremists. What I already knew, what was very obvious already, was that religion, politics, Europe's colonial baggage, also, Western foreign policy failures of recent years were all a part of the picture. But what I was more interested in finding out was what are the personal reasons why some of our young people are susceptible to groups like this. And what really surprised me was that I found wounded human beings. Instead of the monsters that I was looking for, that I was hoping to find, quite frankly, because it would have been very satisfying, I found broken people. Just like Banaz, I found that these young men were torn apart from trying to bridge the gaps between their families and the countries that they were born in. And what I also learned is that extremist groups, terrorist groups, are taking advantage of these feelings of our young people and cynically channeling that towards violence. Come to us, they say. Reject both sides, your family and your country, because they reject you. For your family, their honor is more important than you. And for your country, a real Norwegian, Brit, or a French person will always be white and never you. They're also promising our young people the things that they crave: significance, heroism, a sense of belonging and purpose, a community that loves and accepts them. They make the powerless feel powerful, the invisible and the silent are finally seen and heard. This is what they're doing for our young people. Why are these groups doing this for our young people and not us? The thing is, I'm not trying to justify or excuse any of the violence. What I am trying to say is that we have to understand why some of our young people are attracted to this. I would like to also show you, actually, these are childhood photos of some of the guys in the film. What really struck me is that so many of them, I never would have thought this, but so many of them have absent or abusive fathers. And several of these young guys ended up finding caring and compassionate father figures within these extremist groups. I also found men brutalized by racist violence, but who found a way to stop feeling like victims by becoming violent themselves. In fact, I found something, to my horror, that I recognized. I found the same feelings that I felt as a 17-year-old as I fled from Norway. The same confusion, the same sorrow, the same feeling of being betrayed and not belonging to anyone. Same feeling of being lost and torn between cultures. Having said that, I did not choose distraction. I chose to pick up a camera instead of a gun. And the reason I did that is because of my superpower. I could see that understanding is the answer instead of violence. Seeing human beings with all their virtues and all their flaws, instead of continuing the caricatures, the us and them, the villains and victims. I'd also finally come to terms with the fact that my two cultures didn't have to be on a collision course, but instead became a space where I found my own voice. I stopped feeling like I had to pick a side. But this took me many, many years. There are so many of our young people today who are struggling with these same issues, and they're struggling with this alone. And this leaves them open like wounds. And for some, the worldview of radical Islam becomes the infection that festers in these open wounds. There's an African proverb that says, if the young are not initiated into the village, they will burn it down just to feel its warmth. I would like to ask to Muslim parents and Muslim communities, will you love and care for your children without forcing them to meet your expectations? Can you choose them instead of your honor? Can you understand why they're so angry and alienated when you put your honor before their happiness? Can you try to be a friend to your child so that they can trust you and want to share with you their experiences rather than having to seek it somewhere else? And to our young people tempted by extremism, can you acknowledge that your rage is fueled by pain? Will you find the strength to resist those cynical old men who want to use your blood for their own profits? Can you find a way to live? Can you see that the sweetest revenge is for you to live a happy, full, and free life, a life defined by you and nobody else? Why do you want to become just another dead Muslim kid? And for the rest of us, when will we start listening to our young people? How can we support them in redirecting their pain into something more constructive? They think we don't like them. They think we don't care what happens to them. They think we don't accept them. Can we find a way to make them feel differently? What will it take for us to see them and notice them before they become either the victims or the perpetrators of violence? Can we make ourselves care about them and consider them to be our own, and not just be outraged when the victims of violence look like ourselves? Can we find a way to reject hatred and heal the divisions between us? The thing is, we cannot afford to give up on each other or on our kids, even if they've given up on us. We are all in this together. And in the long term, revenge and violence will not work against extremists. Terrorists want us to huddle in our houses in fear, closing our doors and our hearts. They want us to tear open more wounds in our societies so that they can use them to spread their infection more widely. They want us to become like them, intolerant, hateful, and cruel. The day after the Paris attacks, a friend of mine sent this photo of her daughter. This is a white girl and an Arab girl. They're best friends. This image is the kryptonite for extremists. These two little girls, with their superpowers, are showing the way forward towards a society that we need to build together. A society that includes and supports rather than rejects our kids. Thank you for listening.
Clerics of the Majlis-e-Shura, a religious conglomerate in Jammu and Kashmir, has issued a misogynistic fatwa barring women from going to public places alone. It also said that boys and girls must be taught in separate classrooms. So another one of those misogynistic diktats coming from an organization called Majlis-e-Shura. In what capacity have they issued this diktat? Who exactly do they represent? Those are pertinent questions. But let's just tell you that if you look at your screens, you will see what the diktat says. Number one, it says women should be barred from going to public places. Women cannot go to public events. Music must be banned in marriages. That is the kind of diktats coming in from this organization. It calls itself a religious conglomerate, but which religion exactly talks about this kind of restrictions for women? That is a question that must be put. Pradeep Datta joining us live. Pradeep, put this in context for us. What organization is this? What is their agenda? What kind of diktats these are? Who exactly are meant to follow these diktats in today's time and age?
See, this organization is called Majlis-e-Shura. This is a conglomerate of various religious organizations, and they have issued a diktat, something what we had been hearing during the heydays of Taliban. It's a kind of a Talibani diktat where they have issued, in fact, a fatwa on certain things. As you rightly said, it's a misogynistic fatwa from their side, where they're asking women not to mingle with the men. As per them, any kind of music or dance during the engagement party or the marriage is un-Islamic. So they say that if anybody is found indulging in all these things, they will be socially boycotted. And number two, they say they are terming even co-education as un-Islamic. They have asked the coaching center as well as the schools and the other institutions to teach the girls as well as boys in different classrooms. And the third thing which they are insisting on is that the women should not venture or move out alone. They should either go out with their brother or with their husband or with their father.
And back home, for a state reeling under militancy, it could mark a new trend. The youth of Kashmir are turning to rock music, and for the first time, girls from Srinagar have come together to form a band.
15-year-old Noma preparing for her first assignment in Sufi rock music on the banks of the Dal Lake. The class 9 student and two of her friends have come together to form the first musical band for girls in Kashmir. Pragash, or the first ray of light, is slowly finding its feet in the Kashmir valley.
हमें अभी तक कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं हुई, मतलब सपोर्ट मिल रहा है. हाँ, वो होता है थोड़ा बहुत क्रिटिसिज्म, दैट्स ओके, वो हर एक चीज में होता है.
The band is being trained by Blood Rocks, the first Kashmiri musical band that was set up in 2005. So far, it has trained over a dozen bands from Srinagar.
जितने भी स्टेट्स हमने शोज किए वहाँ पे, हमने बहुत सारी चीज़ें ग्रैब किए और वो हमने स्टेप बाय स्टेप नहीं किए. हम चाहते हैं कि इनको स्टेप बाय स्टेप ऊपर चढ़ा.
In a state where all avenues for entertainment got blocked after the eruption of militancy, music is having a healing effect.
और ऐसे कश्मीरी प्रोग्राम कश्मीरी ज़बान में होना चाहिए. कल्चर है कश्मीरी, इसमें मज़ा आता है सबको.
For all these years of violence, youth of Kashmir have received very little exposure. Activities like these give them an opportunity to present their talent before the world and tell them that given a chance, Kashmiris are next to none. In Srinagar, Zafar Iqbal.
Big focus now. Kashmir's only all-girls rock band is now facing a fatwa from Muslim clerics. The Valley's Grand Mufti, while issuing a fatwa, has called for women in the country to wear a veil at all times. He went on to say that public performances by women are un-Islamic and obscene. The all-girls rock band had earlier decided to give up live performances following threats by extremists. Chief Minister Omar Abdullah had even ordered an inquiry into the threats.
और इस रेप के जिसकी बुनियादें वही हैं जो लड़कियां खुद करती हैं और वो खुद इसके जिम्मेदार हैं. इसलिए उनको चाहिए कि वो पर्दे में रहें. लड़कियों को अपने एक हद में रहना चाहिए. घूमने फिरने के साथ साथ हम उनको ये हिदायत देती है कि वो शर्म से रहें, बेहयाई से रहें, पर्दे में रहें. अगर बाजार जाना हो तो पर्दे में बाजार जाए. अगर कोई चीज खरीदनी हो पर्दे में खरीदें. घर में अगर गाए, अपने कमरे में गाए, अपने तरीके पे गाए, अपने भाई बहनों के सामने गाए, अपनी माँ के सामने गाए, उस पर हमें कोई एतराज नहीं। लेकिन जो बरसर बाजार गाया जाता है, रेडियो पर स्टेज पर गाया जाता है, जहाँ गैर मर्द भी होते हैं, मैंने कहा इससे बहुत सारी खराबियाँ पैदा होती हैं और बहुत सारे खराबियाँ पैदा होने का अंदेशा भी है।
मुफ्ती साहिबान ने अब ये एक फतवा देना एक पेशा बना दिया है हर एक मौजू पे, जिसकी वजह से मजहब बदनाम हो रहा है।
मैं ये मानती हूँ कि बच्चियों को आज़ादी के इतने साल बाद अगर हम किसी काम के लिए रोकते हैं तो हमारा एक ये दोहरा एटीट्यूड नजर आता है। एक तरफ तो हम कहते हैं कि लैंगिकता समान होनी चाहिए और दूसरी तरफ हम कहते हैं कि लड़कियों पे ये रोक लगाइए, वो रोक लगाइए।
चंद लोगों को ये टैलेंट देते हैं, चाहे वो आदमी हो या औरतें हो, कि वो गा सकें, बजा सकें। और अगर खुदा ने कुछ ये टैलेंट दिया है किसी को, तो उसी के नाम पे उस पे रोक लगाना मैं समझती हूँ ये सही नहीं है।
After taking control of the Syrian city of Raqqa in March of 2013, the Islamic State, or IS, a group formerly known as ISIS, has also taken on the role of governing every aspect of daily life under the strict interpretations of Sharia. These Islamic laws cover everything from high crimes to civil disagreements to economics, and even personal behaviour such as diet, prayer and public appearance. Now, what was once a very westernised city is patrolled 24 hours a day by armed men known as the Hizbah that travel throughout the city enforcing their mandate. Vice News joined Hizbah patrol leader Abu Ubaida during Ramadan as they headed to the local market.
احنا من أسباب إقامة الخلافة على منهج النبوة، وأهم شرط لإقامة الخلافة على منهج النبوة هو الأمر بالمعروف والنهي عن المنكر. السلام عليكم أخي. لحظة أخي، بارك الله فيك. السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته. كيف حالك يا أخي؟ الحمد لله. هي زوجتك؟ إيه إن شاء الله. بالله عليك. أول شيء نقابها، شلون يجهضها؟ تحاول تحسن نقابها. عشان لما تمشي ما ترفع العباية، حسن وصلا تحت العباية. يا أخي هذه زوجتك، صمها يا أخي. الله يبارك فيك. الله يبارك. نقول له يا أخي هاي زوجتك ليش تعرضها أنت؟ هي سلعة تعرضها للناس؟ زوجتك أنت ولا شركة فيها الناس يشاركوك فيها الناس؟ فمو معقول أن الناس يشاركوك. أنت مسلم يا أخي ولا مسلم؟ الله سبحانه وتعالى أمر بالحجاب، مو إحنا. فإحنا ندعو، لكن اللي ما يمتثل بالدعوة وبالطيب لابد أن يمتثل بالقوة. هذا
اليوم سوق السبايا، اليوم سوق وما ملكت أيمانكم، اليوم التوزيع. إن شاء الله يعني واحد يهدي لي وحدة. يا ولد زيديتي وين؟
أكثر شيء السبي، يسبون المسلمات ويأخذونها سبية وهو يذبحون ويبيعون. يا يسبوا يعني يبيعونها، يأخذونها مثلا حسب يعني، لأنه بيمنون إذا تكون يعني حلوة وزينة يأخذها مهاجر، يروحوا يبيعونها مع السبايا. هذا الموضوع أكثر شيء تأثرت به، يعني تأثرت به حيل، لأنه اليوم المسلمة تنسبي، هي دين المسلمة تنسبي. والله بالنسبة للسوق يعني مرة بالصدفة مرقت ثاني وغاد شفتهم يبيعون بي، جابوا طبعا من العراق، حتى بعض من الأخوة يحثني إنه خذ لك وحدة وأنت دام إنك يوم.
اللي يريد يبيع أنا أشتري يا أخوة. كم؟ اللي يريد يبيع سبيت وأنا أشتري.